All right, thank you for being here today. My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm the owner of a company called Redistricting Partners, and I was contracted by the city to help out with the redistricting. My role is primarily on the technical, and then also with this, doing presentations before the community to try to get local input. We'll hit on it at the end, but I wanted to start as well by mentioning that there's a website where you can have input. You can put in comments and draw communities of interest, and the information's on the table. And then you can also find the way to give input on the website. If you have questions, we'll have those at the end. And then if you have ideas, things that you want to say, or ideas about how the line should be drawn, it's fine to use your question time to mention that, but it's best to also kind of put that in writing and make sure it's submitted so that the lawyers get a copy of it, the council gets a copy of it, and it's not just my interpretation of what it is you're saying, but it's actually something in writing. So first off, we're here because of the California Voting Rights Act. Santa Ana is in an election system that is called an at-large election system. There are districts, but when you have the election, the entire city votes. And a little historical context, when cities in California were formed, they wanted cities to vote at large, where everybody voted for the council, as opposed to having districts where only little pockets of the city would vote for their own council members. And that was seen as a reform back in the progressive era, because they wanted to get away from that idea of Chicago bosses and, you know, the corruption and ward bosses happening where, you know, somebody could give out jobs for government jobs in exchange for votes, or money in exchange for votes. In these little areas, they said, okay, if elections are at large, nobody's going to have enough political power to control a whole city, whereas they could control a little tiny area. Fast forward over 100 years, and what we find is that the at-large election system doesn't allow smaller areas to have influence. And now, in the current context, what we find is that a small pocket of Latino population in West Covina, or a small pocket of Armenian population in Burbank or Glendale, or a small population of Vietnamese in Santa Ana, they also don't have the ability to influence the outcome of an election in the same way. So essentially, we are in an at-large election system in Santa Ana. At one time, that was seen as ideal. Now the state has said it's not. Now the state has said they prefer districts to be created and for people to only be elected from their district. Racially polarized voting is the precondition for being forced to draw districts and to have district elections. Racially polarized voting means that there's actual proof that people are voting differently based on their ethnicity, their race, other protected class status. An additional term that will get thrown out there, so we've got at-large is a term that we need to know. Racially polarized voting is a term that comes up. Another one has to do with majority-minority, which means a district where the majority of the district is one ethnicity. In the California Voting Rights Act, there's a modified version of that. It's that the population or the ethnicity in a district is dense enough in order for that ethnicity to be able to influence the outcome of the election. So that is a ability to influence. Another thing that changed in the California Voting Rights Act is that this is a very litigious issue, and if a plaintiff comes forward, they can seek damages. The plaintiff can sue and in some cases win millions of dollars in lawsuits against cities that won't go through this proper conversion. And we're actually here in the process. This meeting today is in order to comply with the law to limit the damages that the city would have to pay in a potential legal case. Redistricting is the process of redrawing the district boundaries. Simple as that. When we redistrict, we don't just draw lines that look the prettiest and walk away. We actually have to follow a process that is based on a combination of statute, meaning written laws that tell us how to draw districts, and also case laws, which means that a case law it might not be a written law, but it is how the courts have interpreted the law. And so there are cases in which we use a Supreme Court ruling, even a Supreme Court ruling as recent as last year on redistricting will bear on how we draw the lines here. The Supreme Court ruling last year had to do this very top issue. What is an equal-sized district? We're going to draw districts here, and each district needs to be, quote-unquote, equal size. In Texas, they tried to pass a law that their state senate districts would be drawn to equal size based on the number of voters. However, the Supreme Court found and upheld prior rulings that equal size means the equal number of people, regardless of if they're kids, senior citizens, prisoners, if they're homeowners or renters, or if they live, if they're homeless. That population number is the equal size number that we have to use. So just as recently as last year, this was litigated before the Supreme Court, and we're going to draw districts that are relatively equal size. We're going to draw districts where the largest district and the smallest district aren't more than 5% away from each other in terms of size, in terms of the number of people there. When we look at the city of Santa Ana, the population based on the 2010 census, which is what we're using, is around 325,000 people. If we're to break these districts up, we're going to find that these districts are going to be around 52 to 55,000 people. Something in that range. If we draw them all within that range, we're going to call those equal, because they're relatively equal based on how the Supreme Court has interpreted us to do that. There's another set of data that we're going to be talking about, which is the American Community Survey data. And that community survey data actually shows that we've had population growth here in the city of Santa Ana. And it shows we have 140,000 citizens, and we have current voter registration around 98,000. So that's a really interesting thing when we're talking about data. Because somebody can walk up to you just casually in conversation and say, oh yeah, there's 100,000 voters in Santa Ana, and you have to kind of contextualize that. You're like, wait, I just heard we had 325,000 people who live in Santa Ana. Why do we only have 100,000 voters? So these are all different numbers that we'll be talking about in the process. Another very, very basic criteria of redistricting is that the district has to be contiguous, meaning it has to be one unit. We can't draw a district that starts here where we are today and then kind of hops a couple streets and then starts again somewhere else. A district has to be whole. If you look at some congressional districts around the country, some of them are barely whole, but they all have to be whole. And just for a little, one district in California that isn't contiguous is the congressional district in Long Beach that goes out to Catalina, right? It's not contiguous literally because it's separate, but you have to put Catalina somewhere. So you put Catalina with an area that you can get to where the ferry goes to, essentially, is where you build that district. Maintain communities of interest. This is a key and almost the most important rule in redistricting. And the idea is that if we have a population that cares deeply about something, let's say in the middle of Santa Ana, there's a population that cares about dog parks, okay? And that is a key issue in the city of Santa Ana. It's the biggest issue that you guys are dealing with, dog parks. And it's the people in the middle of the city that want that. Would we do what they used to do in the South with the African American population and take that dog park population and draw like pizza districts where every district gets a tiny bit of that dog park population and dilute that vote into every district? That's what they did with the African American population to make sure that African Americans couldn't get elected to Congress in the South. Or do we draw a district all the way around that population, right there in the middle of the city, and we'll call that the dog park district, the district where the community of influence that's really driving the discussion there is the people who care about a dog park. And there's going to be a council member elected where that community can actually influence who's going to get elected. And we've now strengthened that community of interest. So the ideas in redistricting, as they've developed over the last hundreds of years, has been around strengthening and reinforcing communities of interest, not dividing them, not diluting them. When we talk about communities of interest, we're not really talking about dog parks. So if somebody has a dog park comment, please send it to the website. Don't tell me about it. But we are going to talk about communities of interest. Key communities of interest have to do with ethnicity, protected classes under the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And in this area, we're talking about Latinos and Asians primarily. We could also talk about African Americans potentially in some areas. I've done redistricting in Glendale, where I grew up, and we talk about Armenians. I've done redistricting in North San Diego County, where we talk about Chaldeans, who are Iraqi Catholics. And there's other communities in California that we might discuss depending on where we are. Here in Santa Ana, we're primarily going to be talking about Latinos and Asians as ethnic communities of interest. When we talk about those populations, we can see that the city is, based on that citizen voting age population number I talked about, 17% Asian and 60% Latino. So the 17% Asian, you all presumably live in the city of Santa Ana. Is the 17% Asian like spread out evenly in the city of Santa Ana? Or is it kind of pocketed like that dog park community I was talking about? I think the data that we'll look at essentially how that population lays out. And looking here, we can see the Latino population. I've taken the Latino population from the census and I've mapped it with this gradient to show density. And if you look, the most dense parts of Santa Ana, here's a census block group, which is an area of about 1,500 people, that's 99% Latino. We have others 98, 96, 88. So this means that these communities are almost entirely Latino. We have in this other shaded with gradient an Asian population. When we get to the Asian density in these areas, it's not as strong or as heavy in terms of the Asian population, but it is fairly strong Asian population. And I want you to notice something here. We have a relatively heavy Asian population. This is the Santa Ana River. We have a little area here with only 3% Asian, so I'm not sure exactly what that is. A little area here with 16%. This creates a little hook. So we might come back and see that again. I just want to draw your eye to that. We also have an Asian population that kind of comes down here, which is interesting because while we have a very heavy Asian population here, one of the questions we're going to have to address is, does this Asian population here most view itself as a community of interest with this Asian population here, or does it most view itself as a community of interest with this Asian population down here? That's an abstract thought for us to think about as we draw these lines. There are other communities of interest, and I earlier used the example of a community of interest that supports dog parks. But you could have communities of interest around people living near a certain industry. Maybe they live down, Main Street where businesses are. Maybe they live near a college campus. Maybe they live near an industrial part of town. Maybe they live in a very bedroom, suburban, single-family homes part of town. Maybe they live in a part of town with lots of apartment complexes. And these can be communities of interest. People who live near senior citizen centers. I did redistricting in Santa Barbara County, and one of the biggest issues was a community that is almost entirely 25-year-olds. It's all the college students. And almost all the population there is graduate students, some young college professors, and undergraduates who aren't living on the campus. Access to amenities. Could be people who live near a coast, or people who live near a hillside, or people who go hiking. In LA County, there's a whole bunch of areas where, that access to wildlife is actually a key issue. In Los Angeles, there's a place called, they call them the horse people. There's a whole community in LA County in San Fernando Valley that their biggest issue is horses. And you can drive down there and it's like you're 10 minutes out of the city and all of a sudden there's horses walking around. Environmental issues, like I said, homeowners versus renters, other communities of interest. Another criteria that we use in order to make sure that we're drawing lines that are fair is as much as possible to follow existing boundaries. So when you are in your community, the school district, maybe the school district lines were drawn 100 years before we were all born. However, they come to mean something. Like, I know what school I went to. I know what high school, elementary, junior high, and that became my community as I got older. What city you live in, obviously, is a key criteria when you're looking at some redistricting. What neighborhood you live in. These might start, like they might just name a neighborhood 50 years ago, but through the course of time, that being in that neighborhood actually starts to mean something. So these are ways in order to kind of bring together communities of interest. And then keeping districts compact. That means not having districts that are long, squiggly lines, but having districts that are more squares and circles and make sense. Now, we're not going to be able to do all these things in all cases. We might follow a governmental boundary, which means that our lines get kind of squiggly. We might draw a district that isn't necessarily compact. We might split a community of interest because we have to keep the relatively equal population. So all of these kind of play within each other when we draw district lines. So first off, these are our current districts. And we have one district essentially that's in the top, and then the other districts are a little bit more horizontal, or a little more vertical. This 3 districts right here, 3, 5, and 6. Remember when I showed that Asian population that was very heavy? I essentially showed that there was an Asian population down here, here, and up in here. So essentially we have taken that Asian population, the current districts, and divided it into 3 districts. So that is one of the reasons why the plaintiff sought to have these districts lines changed. When we look at the neighborhoods, we can see these neighborhoods, and we can use these as a starting point for potentially drawing districts. And you can see some of these neighborhoods all share like a main thoroughfare. There's little horizontal and vertical boundaries that are kind of shared by these neighborhoods. So this actually becomes a very interesting way for us to start to think about drawing districts is, can we utilize these neighborhoods and try to unify neighborhoods as a part of the districting process? When we look at these districts, the handouts actually have some interesting looks at population, the voting age population, and these 2 columns really are interesting to me. It seems as though these neighborhoods, to a large extent, serve as kind of proxies for where the ethnic population is. You'll have areas that are extremely high Asian population and other areas that are extremely high Latino population. So these neighborhoods are meaning something, and there's an interplay between the ethnicity and the neighborhoods as I see it. Looking at the underlying other political geographies, the first one that jumps out when I actually start drawing these is this Garden Grove Unified School District and the shape that it takes over the city. This is the districts for the Senate District, 34th Senate District. And potentially, I don't know what the justification was for drawing them like this, but you would believe that this was part of a community interest that happened when they did the state redistricting process. This actually is more interesting to me, the congressional districts. You can see it appears as though in the congressional district boundaries, they took into account this Asian population, and the 46 was drawn to maximize the Latino population, and the 48th was drawn to maximize the Asian population of that seat. So that's an interesting kind of precursor to our conversation. Then finally, this is precincts. And I don't generally take precincts into a real heavy consideration when I'm drawing districts, but there's something interesting about a precinct. If I have a precinct like this maroon-shaped little thing down here, what am I saying when I draw that precinct? If I'm the county registrar, if I'm the county, I'm saying that not only do these people live close to each other, but they're basically all walking distance from the same polling place. These people are connected, and they are drawn into a precinct. That precinct might have some weird shapes, but they're not going to draw a precinct that is divided by a river. They're not going to draw a precinct that's divided by a major freeway. They're not going to draw a precinct in a way where you can't get from one side of the precinct to the other. So precincts aren't necessarily bad kind of underlying sub-geography. Now, when we had the first meetings months ago, The only thing we were trying to get as public input was, where is your community of interest? That, this is my dog park friends. This is my people who go to the school. These are the people that I go to church with. These are the people that are a community within the city of Santa Ana that should be respected in the redistricting process. We still want that information. However, now on something else too from the public. And that is, I've drawn 4 versions of sample maps. And what we want is questions and thoughts about those lines and input from the public in ways that can help make it better. So I'm going to present some maps and talk to you a little bit about each of them. But the idea is, these are not necessarily what the city is going to adopt. These are a way for us to start to have a conversation about the lines that takes into account, like, okay, I've already made them equal size. I've tried my best to do X, Y, and Z criteria. How do you think they should be changed? Which map do you think best represents your view of the communities of interest and how the city lays out? For each of these maps, there's a visual map with an underlying mapping of the neighborhoods. They're all over there on the wall as well in good detail. There's one version over there that even you can see the street names if you wanted to go kind of figure out where the streets are that these boundaries are based on. There's also a data table that shows a few different things. We've talked about population, equal population. The largest district in here is 441 people over the median. The smallest district here is 418 people under the median size. As a result, this first plan, the biggest district is 1% above, the smallest district is 1% below. So just for shortcuts, we're going to say that this has a 2% deviation. The largest to the smallest is 2%. That's well within what would be considered an acceptable range of equal population. The next thing to look at is, you could look actually at this 18-year-old citizens, and there's really an interesting thing to note here is that this really varies. You have one district that's only 17,000 population in terms of 18-year-old citizens or people who would be eligible to vote. There's another one here that's 27,000, another 27,000, a 25,000. So there's this real range. We're not drawing districts to try to keep these equal. The Supreme Court has said we can't draw districts to try to keep these equal. We have to draw districts to try to keep these equal. But this is interesting nonetheless. And it's from this data that we can say that this District E with 17,000 people is 82% Latino. And this District F is 65% Latino. Here's another district with 74% Latino, 58% Latino. We have 4 districts that would be considered majority-minority Latino districts. We have one district, this District A, which is 43% Asian. And that would make that district what we would consider an influenced Asian district, a district wherein the Asian population, to the greatest extent possible, is able to influence the outcome of the election and elect a candidate of their choice. Doesn't mean elect an Asian candidate, but it means elect a candidate that they unify behind and can support. So we have a data table for each one, and we have a map for each one. Let's look real quickly at this map. This map actually draws a little bit more from the existing city boundaries. A key thing we were trying to do was to try to unify the Asian community a little bit more and to stop it from being divided as much. However, it still does divide the Asian community a little bit, but not to the same extent of the existing plans. We still have a little bit of vertical boundaries here. We maintain a number of the neighborhoods by following the neighborhood lines. But this is just a first stab using the existing city boundaries. And you might think that this doesn't differ enough, but that's kind of a first look. A second version of the district boundaries, remember that hook I talked about where there was a census block group that was 3% Asian, and another census block group that was around 15% Asian? This version of the plan makes a lot of significant changes in the overall composition of the districts, but it creates this Asian district following the Garden Grove Unified School District boundary here, following this area to try to make sure that the Asian population isn't diluted by taking this and putting it into that district, and then trying to follow neighborhood boundaries and trying to keep those neighborhoods as whole as possible. Following a major arterial road here, essentially following some of the same boundaries that are used in the existing plans and the neighborhood lines. Plan C, you still have this hook, but I want to introduce a totally different new concept in Plan C. Remember when I said that there was an Asian population here to the south? And one of the fundamental questions that we would have to answer is the Asian population here more a community of interest with this portion here? Or is this portion here more of a community of interest with this northern portion? How do we can't do both. We can't draw a district that is equal population, all the districts equal population, where this Asian population, and this Asian population are all unified in one seat. That district would be way too huge. However, we can draw a district potentially that comes down here and captures the southern portion of the Asian population. So that's just a way or an option for drawing these. In District D, again, now here we're at 44% Asian. District D is the one the plaintiffs wanted to make sure we give a little bit of more emphasis to, because in of the plans that were drawn so far, it was the one that they claimed was most supported by what they wanted to do. And essentially what that district did, very simply with District A, is it follows the Garden Grove Unified School District to a maximum extent possible, and then draws the rest of the districts, again, maintaining neighborhoods, following some of the major roads that divide the neighborhoods, and keeping the districts relatively equal size. This plan does need to be modified before it can be actually implemented, because, as you can see, one district's 4% over, another district's 3% under. That means 7% deviation, where other plans were only 2% deviation. So this plan isn't fully baked. We need to address some things to try to figure out how to balance this district. But hopefully in the conversations about communities of interest, what people like and don't like about different plans, we can start to try to get that information. Now, one question that was asked at the last meeting that I want to make sure we address was, we're talking a lot about race. We're talking about Asian populations, Latino populations. And in our culture, as Americans, oftentimes we don't talk about race so overtly. Oftentimes it's kind of just, you know what they're talking about, they're really talking about race, but you're not saying it out loud. In redistricting, we are. We are not going to draw these districts entirely based on race. That's not legal. But we are going to draw these districts to keep them equal size, to follow existing governmental boundaries, to make districts that are fair and follow all the rules, and still be cognizant of making sure that none of the plans that we draw could be seen as diluting the voting power of any protected classes. And that's why we're here. The process from here forward is that we're going to continue to have community meetings. Our next one is on Saturday at 10 a.m. here in the city. And we're going to continue to give this presentation, have these maps available. The maps are available on the website. More data is available on the website. There's a tool for you to draw your community of interest on the website, and also to submit information. There are handouts, and right now is an opportunity, if you have any questions, to come up. Take a couple minutes if you have a question. And again, if you have a kind of a longer, more involved kind of input, make sure that anything you say or anything you're thinking, try to articulate it and get it on the website as well, because that's where we can really make sure that it's going to be seen by everyone. The first card I have is from Catalina. In the microphone?
Mi nombre es Catalina Castellón y yo soy parte del Comité de Ojo. Estoy aquí para apoyar el plan D. Okay. Entonces, lo que nosotros queremos es sí ver ese cambio que vamos a tener por distrito.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Naboko. I represent Oakland, and we're supporting Plan D, and we want to see those changes happen.
And the name of the group was?
OCO, Organizaciones, Congregaciones Comunitarias del Condado de Orange.
I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yes.
Great.
Hello, my name is Tina Wilson. You mentioned plaintiff a couple of times in the conversation.
She's asking about the plaintiff, and the plaintiff means the person who is bringing the lawsuit.
Is there a current lawsuit?
The lawyer standing right next to you.
I'll get it there.
So she'll answer. You can answer from there if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
That'll be easier.
Yes, there is a current lawsuit. The plaintiff's name is Elisa Lee, and it relates to a claim that there is racial polarization in the city, and that it is causing Asian members of the community to not be able to. It's racially polarized voting is the allegation of the lawsuit, and the allegation is that because the Asian population are divided into different districts, that they are unable to elect a candidate of their choice or influence an election sufficiently that they can have their voice spoken for.
Is this the pivotal point that's driving the redistricting?
Yes, that's why we're here.
Okay. And the bottom line is that it's not a matter if the redistricting will occur, but in what manner it will occur, in what configuration it ultimately will occur. So that the old one is in essence going out. But the question is what will the new one look like?
Yeah, there will be a vote of the public in the November election. However, if the public, there's two ways essentially this can go. One is the public engages, we draw lines, and that's what ends up getting adopted and the public supports it. Or a court could come in and a court could draw the lines without any of this public input. So that's essentially where we're at, is trying to follow the state law that gives us a process, a certain number of hearings within a certain timeline to do this, to take this process through and make sure that whatever we're able to draw is maximizing the public input and these kind of forums, because a court could have, if we decided not to do this, a court could tomorrow just draw the lines they want and be done.
And would that redistricting court drawn line be part of that also lawsuit?
Yeah, there could be, the court would always have an option if the city wasn't complying to impose district boundaries, and that would be the end of the story.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Did you? Oh, come on.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Karen. I just wanted to know where are the other numbers? I know you posted based on population and I believe residents that are able to vote. Do you have any data on the other numbers, like low income, education levels? Are those taken into consideration?
Yeah. So the census has a ton of other data, such as education, house price, healthcare measures, and even how long people drive to work and other things like that. Oftentimes, if somebody in the public says, we want to draw these districts based on commutes, because the biggest issue is there's a whole community here that always has to commute down to, San Diego or up to LA, and that's a community of interest. Then that kind of data will come into play. and I'll do my best to try to find that data. As an example, I did redistricting in a couple cities where the gay population was the driving factor, and I went and talked to people at the LGBT centers and talked to LGBT organizations to try to build that data so that that community input could be reinforced with data that can be mapped. So we do have more data that would be available if there's something in particular that the community says, you know, as an example, let's say there was a fight between homeowners and renters that I didn't know about, and somebody said, can you find out where the homeowners and renters are? Then sure, I would go through the process of trying to unearth that data and make it part of the discussion. So if there's a specific, then that's a great thing to either mention or to submit to the website, and even to draw a map and say, my community of interest is this area because of these criteria, and we want the staff or the demographer to try to find more data on that so that they can actually map it and draw districts to consider that.
Okay. I don't know if this is a question that you can answer, but maybe this is just a comment in general for the city folks here. I was just like wondering how this information is kind of accessible to the community, just because I feel like this wasn't really well circulated, but also as in, you know, maybe I can understand it just because I've been around these numbers or something like that, but maybe not necessarily my mom. So, you know, I kind of feel like if there is someone here that can help answer that question as to, you know, how this information is constantly kind of being circulated to, you know, members and in a simplified version, you know, so they get the so what picture.
Yeah. So thank you for your comment. The city website does have all of this information, and maybe the staff can speak to what they've done to make sure this information gets out and disseminated. However, I have to be frank with you, a lot of this is confusing. I don't know if my mom understands it. And that's one of the really valuable things about this presentation. I think everybody in this room knows more today, right now, about redistricting than 99.9% of, you know, the city. And it's inherently a policy area, very heavy with math, lots of new terms, talking about the census and other data that makes it hard to engage. And that's exactly why the state law says that we have to have these community meetings and these forums over and over and over, because it's an attempt to try to get this information out. And it's really hard to try to get everybody up to speed, but I know the city has been working on this.
We did, as part of the settlement discussion and as part of this whole process, we did get lots of information out to the community. It's very difficult to get every single person, but we sent out notices to school districts, a bunch of community groups, church groups. We published this. We sent it out to the neighborhood associations. It's been published in the newspaper. There's been public hearing notices. There's all the information is on the website. We really encourage you to let other people know that you know that may not have seen it or heard about it or been able to attend one of these meetings, because we want as much input and feedback in the community as we can possibly get. We want to make sure that when we put together this information to draw these lines, we are doing what the community wants in terms of how their community should look for them. This is not about Mr. Mitchell or about me or about staff. This is about what does the community want these districts to look like and how they reflect their neighbors and their neighborhoods.
Thank you very much for your comments. Ramon Silva? How you doing?
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Ramón Silva, residente de Santa Ana de 1960. Tengo ya bastantes años aquí y estoy apoyando el plan D de Dedo porque pienso que está equilibrado en los 6 wards que hay aquí en Santana y para que representara a la gente, a las comunidades un poco mejor. So, yo creo que Plan D es el mejor y pertenezco a OCO, Orange County Community Congregations Organization.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Well, yes, I was also supporting Plan D because I think it reflects more economy in all 6 wards.
Well, thank you. We don't have any more cards, I don't believe. We have more cards? Oh, Connie. How'd your card get snuck up here? I didn't see it. Connie Hamilton. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for being patient. I'm sorry I didn't see it.
I'm going to verify the last comment. He said Plan
D. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Connie Hamilton, and I have sort of a question and kind of an observation here. Well, first of all, there isn't anyone that's going to be all happy about what ordinance you're on, whether the court does it or we do it, because I applied to be on that commission to redo the boundaries, and it came out totally different than people were saying it was. I don't know if it was done skewed after they made the decision, but I will say this, everyone's not going to be happy, I can guarantee you that right now. But my question is, if our council at this point is elected at large, why do we need a board that represents the Asians? Because it's at large anyway. And Nam Pham ran, when Helen ran for board, back then it was Ward 6. Yes. And it was at large, and he didn't get it, but I mean, that's a great candidate. But I mean, if it's at large, why do they need a specific board?
Well, it's not going to be at large anymore. So what they're going to be doing is there's going to be these districts, but under the California Voting Rights Act, the districts have to elect just 1 member each. So each election is going to be separate. And if you were to look at the election result potentially of that at-large election, you might find that the Vietnamese community actually supported that candidate in a way that if they were concentrated in one district, that candidate would have won. But in the at-large system, it kind of dilutes that voting strength. And that's the principle behind the CVRA.
Okay, I thought we were voting on that, whether or not we were going to. So that hasn't happened.
There's
yet.
two things happening at once.
Okay, let's not put the cart before the horse.
Let me kind of explain that if I could. So yes, there is a ballot measure that is going to be on the November ballot, and it was put there by the council voluntarily in order to address the claims of this lawsuit, so that rather than having people elected from a ward but by the whole population, we would go to by district, so that the candidates would be nominated by those who live in their district and only voted for by those who live in their ward. Same thing, district ward. What we know though is that even if the ballot measure doesn't pass, that the court is going to order us to go to districts. So it's important because we want the public to weigh in. We want the public to understand what the issues are and why the ballot measure was put on the ballot. It was put on the ballot because of the issues raised in the lawsuit. And if it doesn't pass, districting is coming in essence. So it would be what we wanted to do as part of this process is to make sure that not only do we get the full public input that we can and that we need, but also that the council can understand what the community wants, so that when they draw these boundaries for these new boards that will be voting only for their own representative, that we are reflecting the community and what the community wants. I hope that.
Thank you. Alrighty, with that, I'd like to say thank you for coming. I also want to note that one of your council members, Jose Solorio, is sitting here, and I guarantee you he's not here to see my presentation. He's seen it 4 times already, but he's here to hear the community input and see that this process is actually working and see this in progress. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and come on Saturday.